As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gon' give up. Fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH-LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning and welcome to the Tom Ficklin Show. My name is Georgia Goldburn and I am the Executive Director of Hope for New Haven and the co-founder of Circle. I would like to take this opportunity just to thank Tom Ficklin for his trust in me in hosting the show in his absence. For today's discussion, we are going to be examining America's childcare crisis and how that evolved from legislation and policies steeped in racial animus, how it has shaped Connecticut early care system, and the plans to fix it. Joining us today, we have with us Dr. William Johnson, and Dr. Johnson is the I'm sorry, I'm losing my bio. Dr. Johnson is a Director of Educational Strategy at the William Casper Graustein Memorial Fund in Connecticut. He brings his lived experience and, He brings his lived community-based experience and education system perspective to the Memorials Fund grant-making strategies, working closely with community stakeholders and strategic partners. Born and raised in New Haven, Connecticut's Hill neighborhood, Dr. Johnson's passion for teaching and education comes from his own experience as a student in a New Haven public school, where he discovered after arriving to college that he did not receive an equitable education. Dr. Johnson is proud to be a second-generation college attendee and holds 3 college degrees, including his ED. Over a 24-year career, he has worked as an adjunct professor, special education teacher, middle school math teacher, first grade reading teacher, assistant principal, executive leadership coach, and assistant superintendent of school. Dr. Johnson's passion in life's work has been educating, supporting, and coaching others to become leaders and make an impact in their communities. He's still very connected to his community in New Haven and many educators across the state. And Dr. Johnson is also a parent of a 4-year-old, so he has personal experience with the early child education system. Also with us is the infatigable Kim Harris. Kim Harris is a product of New Hallville, New Haven, Connecticut, and Highwood, Hamden, Connecticut. But most of all, she is a child of God. Kim holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from Southern Connecticut State University and a television production degree from Los Angeles City College. A few of Miss Kim Harris's accomplishments are: she is a second-generation co-owner, director of Harrison Tucker School, the co-founder and board chair of Inspired Communities, Inc., current chair of New Hallville Community Management Team. She's now in her 8th year. Creator of One City Initiative, which was co-developed with New Hallville Management Team. And Independent News New Havener of the Year. And I could go on and list all of Kim's achievements, but most importantly, she's also I would say most importantly for me, she's also the co-founder of Circle. Most citizens of Greater New Haven know Kim as the outstanding athlete who was an all-state basketball player with Hamden High School. Ms. Harris is a second-generation legacy co-owner with her cousin Karen Tucker of the Harris and Tucker School, which was established in 1970. The school is the only national accredited Black women and family-owned and operated preschool in Greater New Haven. Since its inception, Harris and Tucker School, founded by Kim's mother, Pat Harris, and auntie Margaret Tucker, the family business has touched the hearts and mind of over 10,000 students and parents. The school has always prided itself on three ideals: trusting God, faith, and service to the community. Welcome all. Welcome to the Tom Ficklin Show, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having us.
So before we get started, I would just like to ground people in the history, the very complex history of childcare, and so that the audience can understand how we got here, and it will help to understand the conversation that we're going to have. So the history of childcare in America and its subsequent crisis reveals a multi-layered problem that stems from legislations, policies steeped in racial animus. During a period of colonialism and slavery, black women were not only America's original childcare provider, but also the first to experience the childcare crisis, because while she attended the fields and the children of her master's household, she had no ability to nurture or protect her own. Her condition did not change during Reconstruction, as Jim Crow laws limited Black women to and confined them, or actually fined them if they did not work in farming or domestic labor. FDR's New Deal upheld this colonial paradigm that sought to keep Black women in the labor force with no regard for their children's well-being. Black women were excluded from the Aid to Dependent Children program established by the Social Security Act of 1935, which ensured poor women and mothers could stay home to care for their children, because they were, this of course was not a path for women of color, Black women, because they were expected to be in the labor force. In an effort to appease Southern legislators, the Fair Labor Standard Acts of 1938, which established a federal minimum wage and requirements for overtime, excluded domestic, agricultural, and service occupation, which included childcare. This disproportionately impacted Black women who are relegated to these industries. World War II changed the face of the labor force and the childcare crisis when white women were drafted to work in factories to aid the war effort. The US government responded by establishing universal childcare for the first and only time in history through the Lanham Act of 1941. Lanham Centers were created to assist all families and to subsidize in a manner that required families to pay 50 cents per day, which is about $7 in today's dollars. Lanham Centers were shuttered after the war despite outcries from Black and white women alike. The next time the US government would invest heavily in childcare was in 1964 with the establishment of Head Start, whose success resulted in an effort to deliver universal childcare through its expansion. The Comprehensive Child Development Act in 1971, which would have created nationally funded, locally administered, comprehensive childcare centers for all families on a sliding scale basis, passed Congress with bipartisan support, meaning Republicans and Democrats were on board. President Nixon, however, vetoed the bill, capitulating to the conservatives of his party, who saw this expansion as a slow slide towards communism, fiscal irresponsibility, government overreach, and a threat to the nuclear family. It goes unsaid that the Black nuclear family was not a part of his calculus and a part of his calculation. He opted instead to address the childcare problem through the Revenue Act of 1971, which advanced the now fractured, diffuse, and financially precarious childcare system, and what Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen characterized as a textbook example of a broken market. She further went on to state, it does not work for the caregivers, it does not work for the parents, it does not work for the kids, and it does not work for them. And if it does not work for them, it does not work for the country. So that is a really quick historical context to describe what the childcare industry has been and how it has evolved to the place that it is. So given that historical context, Dr. Johnson, you were charged by Governor Lamont to fix all of this. So Dr. Johnson, you were recruited by Governor Lamont to sit on Connecticut's Blue Ribbon panel on childcare. So can you just share with the audience what the Blue Ribbon panel was and what it was designed to do and the plan that it has created.
So I'm going to be brief, but I will say this. I wish the historical context was shared with everyone on the Blue Ribbon panel before they were convened. Um, but understanding the context in which you shared, to me, it provides people with a different lens. Now, you didn't have to provide that to me because I knew that, right? But I'm talking about the majority of the panel, which was convened to make some recommendations, right, through OEC to the governor around kind of how to tackle these, how to honestly build a sustainable childcare system, but to tackle the crisis that we have. What I'll say is we landed with 4 goals from those recommendations. Obviously, those goals are pushed up, and legislation has to decide kind of how funding works, right? And I think it's important people understand that you have a group of people making recommendations. Number one, recommendations are not policy. I want to be clear.
Yeah.
They're recommendations, and legislation and our legislature will make decisions around how things fall. What I will say is, because I think Georgia, and yeah, it is weird for you or Kim to call me Dr. Johnson, so we're gonna go with Billy because this is
Okay.
um,
We're
what I
all
will
family
say
here.
is,
That's all right.
it just sounds weird coming from people that I know, and I say I know because Kim's aunt and mother had both of my nieces at Harrison Tucker, but I know we'll get into that
Yeah.
as community member. What I will say is I think the important thing is that the crisis piece has been lifted, but also folks have to understand that they play a role in how legislators are going to decide how to deal with this crisis, right? Um, and that we can't look at the childcare crisis as an individual thing. We have to understand how it exists within the context of our broader system. And it's funny, you use the word communism, and throughout history, our government has used that word. And what I tell people is t- communism, or the word communism, has been used in our society as a taboo word, as a trigger word. And what I'll say is what we have is a capitalist society, right? And I think people need to understand what communism is and what it isn't, because we know what it is associated with, and that's a history that folks can look up themselves. But I will talk specifically, we have to understand how a capitalist society creates the environment of a child care crisis, and the conditions that you described in the history of our country, specifically for Black women in childcare. Um, so I'll just start with that based off the history you shared, and just say that the group was charged with making recommendations, and those are not policies. And the group was a vast group of people. And if people ask kind of why I was there, it's because I'm the co-chair of the Early Funders Collaborative, Early Child Funders Collaborative for the state of Connecticut. Obviously, I'm an educator and my father, but I'm not sure myself being an educator or father would have got me a seat at the table.
Absolutely. And we are so grateful, Billy, that you were at the table. I don't know if you remember me calling you in both panic and glee, because when the panel was first created, there were a lot of voices that were missing from the table. And I remember raising one of the major concerns about the fact that one, the racial demographic of the program skewed heavily towards white, skewed heavily towards very affluent people, and there were not very many voices of parents that were there on the panel. And we also lifted up the concern that the family childcare providers, where most the childcare industry evolved from a family childcare setting. That was a jumping off point to this becoming an industry. And those voices, those practitioners were also absent from the panel. So we were successful in getting that voice at the table, but still parent voices are really missing from these conversations. So Kim, I will share with Dr. Johnson, with Billy, that my nieces and nephew also attended Harrison Tucker. And as a matter of fact, the first time when I came to this country in 1989, you were one of my first introduction to a child care center, because I lived in New Hallville and then later on in Southern Hamden. So I saw the Harrison Tucker School, and I saw it grow and evolve to where it is. And you are really an embodiment, Kim, of, who those family childcare providers, those center-based providers of color, and pretty much our ancestors were in this work. Both you and your family just represent an extraordinary place in this work. So I want you to talk about your historical lens, from your historical lens, what that work has meant to you and your community, and what that work looks like today in your community.
So first of all, Georgia, thank you for really having this conversation. And Billy, good to see you again. So in 1970, that's when Harrison Tucker started. But the idea, the concept of Harrison Tucker came out of the civil rights era. It was during the time of civil unrest and just a lot of things going on that weren't equally balanced. And really, my auntie, she couldn't take it anymore. My mother's really calm and cool. My auntie is the one that, she has the fire, and she's the one that started the fire. Aunt Margaret Tucker. And she said to my mother one day, okay, enough of this. Something happened at her job, which was really racially bound. And she said, enough. She said to my mom, you're going to quit your job. We're going to either start childcare or places for senior citizens. Which one do you want to do? My mother said, let's do kids, because they're going to keep us young. So that's how the whole concept came about. Some goodness out of just some real horrific experiences that they had. And the goal was, how do we bring our values? How do we keep hope alive? How do we educate our children in a setting where they're going to get a chance to see people that look like them, where they're going to get a chance to talk about culture of the past, culture of the present, and culture possibly going into the future, which would have been me and my cousin and I. So I first of all, I just want to say that I'm so grateful for this, because I fought it for a long time. I did not think I was going to go into the family business, because I saw how hard it was. I mean, even to this day, it's not easy. The struggle is live and it's real, and it's keeping some of us ill. But we go past that and we keep it going, because we see the good. We see the good that can happen. But in terms of how we manage, how we take this, because I almost feel like I've seen full circle a few times happen. And right now we're probably going towards our third generation of kids coming back. Your nieces were here. Billy, your nieces were here. And I want to say that it is really such a beautiful thing when people trust and believe in an educational system that they know is going to once again speak to their values, speak to the purity of who we are, and just forge forward. Because without like culture and core concepts, it's really hard to just raise our children in a society of today. So I'll leave it right there in terms of the historical background of how this came about for this neighborhood, because our thing has always been, how can we service the people of New Hallville and bring righteousness to them? How do we make that happen so that everyone can have a chance to live better? And that never left my mind.
So, it's interesting, Kim, because I am just always so impressed by you and the work that you do in New Hallville and the way that you see the work that you're doing as a way to transform your community. You're always talking about community transformation. And a beautiful part of the history of this childcare industry is that it has been a tool for women, but more specifically, women of color. As a matter of fact, it is the only part of the educational system that is diverse. Connecticut's K-12 system, and I don't know the stats for higher ed. Billy, you can probably share that, but
It's not diverse.
it's 90% white. It was 90% white when I started teaching some 30 years ago, and it's still 90% white. Early childhood education is the only space that is racially diverse. And part of what we wanted to do, and I wanted to do, is to preserve that racial demographic. And my fear is that that is not going to happen as more and more investments are being made in the system. And as we craft new legislation and new policies to reshape this early care system. And so I'm going to ask a question to both. Do you think that, Billy, that Harrison Tucker can actually exist today, or even be started today the way that her mom and her auntie started it, for the reasons that it started? Do you think, given the current landscape, that that can happen in today's context?
So the advantage, I would say, that Harrison Tucker has is that it started in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the advantage. And what I'll say is the disadvantage that we all have, parents and an organization that started in 1970, is this. And I named capitalism in the beginning because people have to understand what that means, right?
Mm-hmm.
That means profit.
Mm-hmm.
In our case, in our country, the data shows that profit even is more important than people.
Yeah.
And I tell people that's not an opinion, just check our data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we allow things into our country, into our food that make people sick because honestly, it's more profitable for people not to be healthy in our country. Now, whether people do that intentionally or not, I'll leave that up to conspiracy theorists, but I'm just saying capitalism in our country, and capitalism doesn't have to be a bad thing, but this is how it impacts us. So if a family has two parents, two-parent household, they both make $20 an hour, which people think is so much money, which is actually about $40,000 a year, right? So you're talking about $80,000 a year. Rent's probably going to run you now for a two-bedroom if you have two kids and they share a room, maybe $2,000 a month, right? Talking about $24,000 a year, but $80,000 after taxes is really about 67 or 70,000. What I'm really getting at is, although childcare, Kim has an advantage because they started early, right? So there's some advantages in starting early. And Kim, I'm not reading your book, so I don't know your books, but I'm saying, like, let's just say one of her properties is paid off. She doesn't have a mortgage over her head, right? Let's just say that. And this is not, Kim knows I'm not directing this at her, but now her challenge is, right, if she has a family that's coming in net with both parents, $67,000 a year, they can only afford to pay so much. But here's the challenge. Electricity, I don't know about you all, my electricity bill is crazy. So I can imagine Kim's electricity bill is crazy. So Kim, what capitalism and the way our society works, right, which is overtaxing, right, and not paying folks enough, right, on behalf of profits, Kim needs to raise her rates because everything that's going up for the family is going up for Kim, but she can't because the families can't afford it. So now you have parents who are literally living in the negative, and Kim trying to run a business and stay out of the negative, right? So, I'm very intentional about how I'm sharing this, Georgia, because what the system will set you up to believe is, right, Kim, you're charging too much, and the parents ain't paying enough, right? When in actuality, there's not enough resources around for either.
Mm-hmm.
So your question, can someone new do this? Yes, if they're unlicensed. Facts. And you both know, right? So one of the statements, and it's recorded publicly, so I'll repeat it. I believe the commissioner said, like, we don't know how many unlicensed care providers are out there, and they're probably the majority. Well, guess what? And it's not this is no slight towards the commissioner. The fact is, yes, I'm gonna be unlicensed because number one, the demand for care is so high, and I can't afford licensure. I don't have the resources to become a licensor. But like Kim knows better than I will ever know what it costs to maintain a facility and be licensed, and then not be able to charge a rate to actually be able to pay people a livable wage to work for. Because if they're not making, I just told you $20 an hour is $40,000 a year. So you see how the system actually pits the families and the businesses against each other. So it's going to drive, right? We still have the need. So you're going to have more unlicensed care, right? And I'm not saying licensed care is the route because guess what? My great grandmother and grandmother were not licensed, but they were the best care that I think I've ever would have received, right? So I want to be clear. I'm not trying to drive an agenda here around licensed versus licensed, unlicensed. What I'm saying is the way we have this current system set up, specifically for marginalized folks, as you told the history of us, right? We're up against the economic ceiling where we have people who go to college now who are Black, who come home who can't find jobs, who are working jobs that pay $45,000, $50,000 a year, and then they have a family on top of that. And they also have the debt of a college degree, right? Because wealth wasn't passed down over time, as you described, Georgia, right, through our history. So it is extremely impossible in most cases for a new care center in our communities ran by us, right, created by us, to do it without a huge influx of funds because of this relationship that we have with capitalism in our community. And I'm gonna make space for Kim because she has probably much more on the ground experience with it than I do.
Well, I would say this,
Before
that
Before
was
Kim
good.
jump in, I want to put this additional layer onto it because Billy, you mentioned capitalism.
Mhm.
And when we talk about the design of systems, the Blue Ribbon panel had a lot of people that represented businesses, right? A lot of big business in Connecticut. And we are getting involved in trying to fix a crisis that was deliberately or designed to function the way that you shared, Billy, to rework this system because it no longer works for capitalism, right? We discovered during the pandemic that big business could not operate without childcare, right? The governor came to the industry and said, we need you not to go home. So the public school, the K-12 system went home, higher ed went home. The governor came to us and said, you guys cannot go home because we need you to make sure that the other part of industry works. So the interest in this, Billy, you've rightfully pointed out, is capitalism. This new interest in childcare and fixing the system is rooted in capitalism, right? And whenever you see influx and that type of interest coming into the space, you are going to see a sort of a gentrification of childcare, and that is my concern. And so that is a part of the context of why I asked, do you think a Harrison Tucker can exist with now this looming interest by big business and the way that childcare now feeds capitalism? And can a program like a Harrison Tucker or even a Hope Child Development Center, my program, can you see a space for those folks to operate, or even for a Harrison Tucker to continue to operate. So Kim, I've layered on that context to this. So talk to me about where you are, and do you believe, you're an optimist, Kim, but do you believe that your mom and your auntie could set out to do what they did today?
So first of all, really, you were hitting the macro, right, on all of this. And within that context is all these micro things, always trying to negotiate the right pathway for staff with cost on that, trying to renegotiate your credit cards. It's that whole little micro thing that works within how do we survive it with everything that's going, taxes going up, the cost of food going up, the UI astronomical, water bill, so on and so forth. But can we survive? Can we make it? I I feel for sure in different classifications, yes. In the family, I feel like you can. In a group, possibly, absolutely. In a center, maybe, but only with the existence of a circle and with the existence of inspired communities, right? Because now we're trying to dispel all the working in silos, because you're not going to make it working in silos. It's got to be about the collaborative effort. Without that, shared services, working in collaboration, sharing resources, no, even the established institutions are going to have a hard time with it. So unless we work more closely with, what shared services can we do? How do we, I mean, like Circle, right? Shared services, Pampers, supplies. I mean, and it's coming through a grant through your organization, right, Billy? These things are huge. The savings are huge, right? And then the grants that happen with that. All the eligibilities of like the learning pieces that we get through learning for these grants to keep us going. My mother and my auntie would have never gone for some grants, because they didn't trust like that whole system, that caliber of what it was. But now we have to rely on some of these things. And as the grants hop along or hop away, we have to hop along in other ways, right? So that we can really make it. But yes, I believe you can, but you're not going to do it in a silo, or else you're going to be working yourself to death, and it's going to be an early death, not only of your business, but of oneself.
So, and let me just give a little bit of a background on Circle. Circle came out of a vision that both Kim and I had. And Billy, you were among the first to see the vision, some almost 10 years now. Billy, can you believe it? Some 10 years when we were talking about the work that needs to be done we were thinking about how do we preserve the historical legacy of Black women growing and building generational wealth in the childcare industry. And we knew that as more investments come into this space, it was a threat not only just to us, as Kim said, but it's a threat to everybody that has been doing this work in the space, right? But Circle, our vision was to ensure that we make sure that we are preserving those businesses that are operated by women or people of color, more specifically, people who are delivering services to children of color in communities of color. And Billy, when we were describing the idea of identifying people in a community to train them up, it was originally in response to Dr. Gilliam's report on out of school suspension of Black and brown boys. And as people of color, we understood what that was rooted in. And his subsequent research on implicit bias really just affirmed our whole experience of the system. And so Circle was designed, as Kim said, to identify resources and to make sure that those resources get to the providers that are serving the children that those resources are intended to serve. And Billy, you came in at a time when most people could not see our vision, and you said, yeah, I get it. and let's support that effort. And so we are forever grateful to you and Graustein for helping us to create an organization circle that can support this work, this critical work, maintaining or just recognizing the historical context. But going back to this, how we ended up here, because again, everything is rooted in policies, legislation, and again, recommendations are not legislations or policies, but recommendations come from a shared experience, right? And so if you have a blue ribbon panel that is made up of mostly white people that are rooted in corporate America, trying to solve a problem for big business. Do you think, and I know the answer, but I just want to give you an opportunity to respond. Do you think a blue ribbon panel, if they knew the history that I just shared, do you think that could be a place where there could be a framework created to really honor and preserve women of color's role in this industry? I'll have Billy, you're on the panel, so you know the people and you know the work. So I'm gonna ask you to just kind of chime in on
So I'll start
that, and then I'm gonna ask him just to kind of respond to your response.
So I'll start with we said we know the people, we know the people. So I was associated with the people on the panel, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were a few that I know, right? Because in our community, when you say you know somebody, you give that person a little bit of energy. And I'm like, I will not do that. I want folks to understand this was something where folks were brought together.
Mm-hmm.
To answer your question, my answer is like, no, just given the history is not enough. See, for me, from my perspective, number one, knowing the history, right? If I were creating a panel, everyone on the panel would need to know the history.
Mm-hmm.
The panel would have overwhelmingly been women for all the reasons we know. Like I don't even, if people don't understand why I'm saying that, then they need to do a little history check. And it absolutely needed to be overwhelmingly women of color, right? Since they make up the absolute majority of the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the recommendations from that group, number one, because they have the lived experience and the work experience, because they're the people doing the work, and they have the historical context. I believe the way we talked about the recommendations would have been different and been more intentional. Because you're right, right? The response, in my opinion, because I think, 20 people on that panel may have their own opinions, but my opinion is aligned with yours. The reason why we were responding is because of the crisis and its impact economically, not because, and I say we, but I don't mean everyone, not because we care about kids and people. So when I made the comment around capitalism doesn't have to be a bad thing, because you could have capitalism and center the wellness of people, meaning you don't have an employee making $20 an hour, which that is not our minimum wage, but whatever, if they made $20 an hour, but the CEO makes 20 million a year. See, that's bad capitalism, right? Because now the people who are creating the wealth, right, actually are living in working poverty, right? So I do believe if the makeup of the panel looked different based on the historical context that you gave, I think a lot of the things a lot of the four goals probably would have been the same, but how they were outlined would have looked different. Priorities on how you carry them out would have looked different. Because I believe on the panel, there was one childcare provider? One childcare provider, I remember.
It was three childcare providers.
But we're such a large panel.
Actually, no, four childcare providers.
But we were such a large panel, right? 4 voices out of what, 20 something, right? You get what I'm getting at, right? Where
Mhm.
if you had the majority of folks on the panel who reflected the history of it and the issue, I do believe the recommendations would have looked different, without a doubt. But just given that current panel, which to me was in response to the economic crisis, not the see, and I think there's we say the childcare crisis because it is the childcare crisis. But
Mhm.
the only reason the attention was shined on it is because the impact on the economics. Because there's
Yeah.
always been a childcare crisis. We've always
Yeah.
known. So I'll leave some space for Kim, but that's from my perspective.
Okay. So Kim,
I
could that
want to,
panel really do the labor that was required to honor that historical context?
so repeat that again, Georgia. I'm sorry.
So could that panel, given the historical context of the history of women of color in childcare and the makeup of the panel, do you think they could really do the labor to really create a space to reserve and preserve women of color's role in the industry?
We could always do better. We could always do more. Let me say that first of all. And I I agree with Billy in terms of, and Georgia, you and I have this conversation probably 10 times a day
Mm-hmm.
um, about the crisis in childcare and how the blue ribbon panel, because of the whole economic downturn and things of that nature. I I want to say that I feel like it's I'm grateful for for the blue ribbon panel that it existed, right? And it did not exist because we see it. We're on the ground day to day. We see everything that's going on because we live it. We are actually having the lived experiences, and not to say that they're not or they haven't, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it was critical. I mean, just like everything that happened during the whole COVID thing, it was a monster. I even go worse. It was a beast. It was like the beast tenfold. It was hard. It was so hard. And just grateful for the funding that came down. And I always say to Georgia, I say, Georgia, and I'm gonna just mild this out. Like, Georgia, this is the way we should be living. We're getting funding in that puts us at a level where we're able to do things for our staff, do things within our school, do the things that are necessary to really have a viable business. This is how we should be living.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I hope that as time goes on with the Blue Ribbon Panel, because I don't know, I hope that as time goes on with the Blue Ribbon Panel, that they are able to see where, and I think they already know, like the things that are really so necessary and so needed so that we can make this thing happen. Community people, right? Without getting pushed to the side, because big business, they're gonna come in. It's just the nature of how things are gonna happen. And it's daycare gentrification. And we hope that we can, really be able to carve out a piece for us, those that are doing it that are not in the corporate setting, who can really move this thing along so that people can see that there's options. Because I think once the corporate level comes in and they start buying into that, I think options go by the wayside.
Yeah.
I think it's less, and I think it's less us in terms of the community fraction of who we are and how we function. And when I say less, it's less of our values, it's less of what parents will be vying for. And to me, the American way is to have those options. We really need to make sure that this blue ribbon panel moves forward so that parents can have options in how they want their children to be educated for life. Because this is a critical time. This is so critical. This time of before 6 years of age.
So in our last 10 minutes, I would just say, you know, right now, a budget implementer has dropped for how we are going to proceed for the next year. I've not had the opportunity to look to see what's in there. Billy, you talked about the tension between parents not being able to afford the space, and providers, more specifically providers of color, not being able to deliver the type of quality that they want to deliver because they're just as squeezed as everybody else. Right now, the current crisis is that it's taken families who needed about 6 months to get a Care for Kids certificate, whereas 2 years ago, it took them, actually a year ago, it took them 1 month to get a Care for Kids certificate. I don't have to explain to anybody here how that hurts communities of color when a parent who has to go to work who cannot afford childcare has to wait 6 months because of the lack of investments in the system to really help those families to get into work. And we're hearing that there's some money added to the bottom line, but we don't know right now. I can't say right now how that's gonna really work. So a part of our job as Circle is constantly pushing back against the system and making sure that that system works for providers, families of color, children of color, communities of color. That's our thing. We recognize that if we fix it for these communities, we fix it for everybody in America, right? So Billy, you are in the philanthropic space, and I don't think we talk enough about the role of philanthropy in this space. And talking about capitalism again, that's also a unique area where lots of money lives and have lots of impact and can drive lots of decisions in Connecticut. So what do you think philanthropy's role is in helping to think about what Connecticut's early care system needs to look like, given the historical context? And how do you think philanthropy needs to push against the system to move the needle?
So I've now been in philanthropy. I'm working on the 7th year now, right? And I'll tell you, I've learned a couple of things, which I tell folks is there's definitely different types of philanthropy, right? And so there was, I believe, a child care fund created, right, at the state.
Mhm.
And they're looking for philanthropy to kind of put dollars there. And obviously, I don't represent all philanthropy. I represent a philanthropic organization that names racism and poverty as a problem. And I found another one that names it that way. So I want to be clear when I'm talking from the context of an organization that names racism and poverty as a problem. I actually believe using dollars to do what we know is important. And Kim, I'm going to push this thought because I don't want our piece of the pie. I want an equitable piece of the pie, right? I think for a very long time, historically, we've been given a slice, right? And I say oppressed people. And if you don't know what that means, I know you all know what that means for the listeners, right? Oppressed people have always been given a slice, and that's what keeps oppressed people, in my opinion, from organizing for change. So philanthropy, as I see it in our organization, right, is how are we getting resources, right, to those folks who are oppressed by those very issues? And we have them all over the state. They're the oppressed people everywhere in this state because they're the huge equity gap. How do we give them the resources to organize, right, to put people in the seats that make the decisions about our day-to-day lives, right? Now that may sound that's not even radical. That's literally what our civic engagement at a basic level is supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right? Who are the people who make the decisions about what funds go where? And what is our responsibility? And everybody gets taxed, by the way. I always tell people if you work, you're getting taxed, right? Everybody except the people in that 1%. So let me just throw that out there. So I think philanthropy's responsibility is not necessarily from my standpoint, and I believe my organization it would be aligned, like not to throw our money into a pot and say, hey, how do we use this fund to do whatever we're doing for early childcare? No, it's how do we get resources in the hands of the people who are most affected by these issues so they are able to organize and put people in those seats to change the policy, right, that doesn't allow them access. And just to give people perspective, because, you know, there's foundations with billions of dollars, right? Our foundation couldn't fund the general operations of New Haven Public Schools for a year. So we're not that big. So because I think people, and don't get me wrong, $100 million is a lot of money to me. $1 million is a lot of money to me as an individual, right? But if you put us in the context of the broader system, right? Some folks say, well, philanthropy should just fund it. Well, I'm like, we can't even fund New Haven Public Schools for a year with our endowment. But that doesn't mean there aren't endowments in this state that could change the trajectory of early childhood, because they do exist. But I do believe if foundations want to really have an impact and make a change, I don't think you put your money into the system. You put your money into the hands of the people who need to change the system. So that's how I feel philanthropy's role should be. I will tell you, I don't believe many folks openly, publicly, and other foundations will speak about it that way. And that's just because I've shared space. But I think I'm adjacent, I am directly adjacent to the issue we're talking about. Like, it's a lived experience. So I understand that putting money into this system to do something different isn't the answer.
Okay. So I appreciate that context, Billy, and I so agree with you. I also believe that you have to put the investments in the people on the ground, and that's the belief, the fundamental belief of Circle. Kim, I'm going to ask you to solve this crisis in 1 minute with with your well-crafted, well-thought-out plan for how do we change the system. And I want you to use not your early care lens, but your lens as the director of Inspired Communities, Inc. So how do you think in about 1 minute, Kim, or 2 minutes, that we solve this problem?
So yeah, one way that we solve this problem, I alluded to earlier, we're definitely working in collaborative efforts. But the other piece is this: with Inspired Communities, Inc., our one big, huge goal is how do we now, in a 10-year plan, start training up the next mayor, the next alders, the next people who have the power of the pen, right? Because until we get on that train of training our children to be able to have something to come back to, first of all, which Inspired is doing, we have to build up the vitality in our neighborhoods so that the kids don't go to college, get all that information and leave us. How we build it up so that they come back and they say, okay, you know what? When I was trained up in this particular program, I can now go anywhere, but I choose to stay here because I have everything that I need to make a difference and to change this community. So if we're not thinking like, the Chinese people, 100-year out plan, Yale, 100-year out plan, 50-year out plan, this is what we're doing at Inspire. We have a 10-year plan where we're saying that this group of kids that I have right now, they're going to be able to be the next mayor. They're going to be able to be the next alder. As a matter of fact, the day that some of them turn 18, we're putting their feather in the hat so that they can be running. No lie. You've seen us, Georgia. There are kids out there advocating live and for real as the Zooms come up of issues that pertain to them. So if we're not doing those things of training that next generation and getting some real positive, good, strong mentors around them and making sure that they touch every avenue of the things that move a city. Like development is huge right now in the city, right? So we got to make sure that our kids are around developers. Right? We have to make sure our kids are around politicians. We have to make sure that our kids are around those people, because if we don't, the status stays as it is. So we're seeing development, we're seeing change because we're doing those things.
All right. So I would just like to thank Dr. Billy Johnson, and Kim Harris, both indefatigable people. New Haven is tremendously blessed to have you both. We're Grateful for this wonderful conversation. And we would just like to once again thank Tom Ficklin for the opportunity to bring us together to have this conversation. And with that, I would just like to thank you all and to thank the listeners for joining today. Have a good one.
Thank you.
As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up. Fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.